Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into some seriously controversial territory as we break down the claims made in the book The Unvaccinated by Unbecoming. For this session, we're acting purely as neutral reporters. We're just here to map out the architecture of the author's arguments so you can understand exactly what this text is actually proposing. To wrap our heads around this sprawling thesis objectively, we're going to break the author's arguments down into 5 main pillars: the baseline of health, the first intervention, the architecture of deception, the pediatric system, and finally, historical disease decline. Let's get right into it. So, the entire premise of this book centers on one bold, heavily disputed idea. The author argues that if you compare completely unvaccinated populations to vaccinated ones, you uncover a hidden truth about chronic illness in our modern world. It's an argument that really challenges the very foundation of modern pediatrics. Right out of the gate, the author hooks the reader with this profound statement. The comparison that medicine declares unethical to run has run itself. What does that mean? Well, they're arguing that while the medical establishment says it would be totally unethical to deliberately withhold the childhood vaccine schedule from a control group to study the effects, that natural control group actually already exists all across the United States. Section 1, the baseline of health and this idea of a natural control group. The author leans heavily on something called Joy Garner's Control Group Survey. And the contrast they highlight here is massive. They cite a 60% chronic illness rate in the highly vaccinated general population, compared to a microscopic 2.64% in the unexposed group. The author uses this data to argue that the skyrocketing rates of chronic disease we see today aren't natural, they aren't genetic, and they aren't inevitable. Instead, they claim they are iatrogenic, meaning directly caused by medical interventions. To really hammer this home, the text zeroes in on one specific intervention. The claim here is that exposure to just the vitamin K shot alone, without any other vaccines at all, spikes a child's risk of developing at least one chronic condition by an unbelievable 344%. Which brings us to Section 2, the first intervention, specifically that vitamin K shot. Let's look at the math the author uses to break down this very first injection. They point out there's merely 2 milligrams of active, synthetic vitamin sitting alongside 39.5 milligrams of inactive ingredients. And the book goes hard after these inactive ingredients. They point out things like polyoxal 35 castor oil, which is a known irritant, and benzyl alcohol, which the author claims has actually never been tested for toxicity in this specific context. Because of all this, the author starts redefining common medical terms through their own lens. Take the word idiopathic. Normally, that just means a disease has an unknown origin. But the text argues that when 60% of babies get jaundice right after receiving their vitamin K shot, the medical establishment simply calls it idiopathic. In the author's view, they literally inject the cause, the synthetic vitamin K, watch the effect happen, and then just throw up their hands and declare it a mystery. All right, Section 3, the architecture of deception and how these systems of control operate. Here, the author pieces together this massive historical puzzle using a very specific legislative timeline. They start in 1969, noting when biowarfare program terms supposedly entered public health language. Then we hit the pivotal 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. The author claims this act completely stripped ordinary liability away from vaccine manufacturers, which then caused the childhood schedule to just explode. Fast forward to 2001's authorization for use of military force and the 2005 International Health Regulations. The book argues this exact sequence built a closed loop of permanent emergency powers and legal shields, all perfectly disguised as public health initiatives. Moving on to Section 4, the pediatric system and its financial incentives. So, as you might guess, a huge part of this argument comes down to money. The text alleges systemic financial motives, claiming specifically that insurance companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield actually pay pediatricians a $400 bonus for every fully vaccinated child. But here's the catch, according to the book. That bonus only pays out if the doctor meets a strict quota, say 63% of all their patients being fully vaccinated. If they drop below that threshold, the bonus vanishes. So the author is basically saying a medical practice's financial survival depends entirely on strict vaccine compliance. Because of those incentives, the author views the routine baby visit in a completely different light. It's not framed as a health check, but strictly as a compliance mechanism. The argument is that by keeping infants on this relentless schedule, 2 weeks, 2 months, 4 months, and so on, the child never actually leaves the medical system long enough to establish what normal health looks like. The book sees these visits as a recruitment tool to indoctrinate families into a lifelong dependence on medical interventions, just to manage the chronic diseases these very visits allegedly cause. Meaning, if you've ever felt rushed or pressured during a standard checkup, the author argues that's a feature of the system, not a bug. And our final pillar, Section 5, historical disease decline and mortality rates. The text makes a really bold historical claim here. It insists that major diseases like measles, tuberculosis, and smallpox had already declined by up to 98%, way before their respective vaccines were ever widely introduced. So, if not vaccines, what caused the massive drop in mortality? The author gives all the credit to sanitation, clean water, vitamin A, labor laws, and just generally improved living conditions. Essentially, the book argues that vaccines simply showed up at the very end of the battle to take credit for a victory that was actually won by plumbers and improved infrastructure. To back this up, the book repeatedly points to a specific historical case study, the 1885 Leicester Rebellion in England. The author claims that a massive smallpox outbreak hit the city despite having 95% vaccination coverage. So the citizens revolted, they stopped mandatory vaccinations, and the vaccination rate plummeted to just 10%. Now, the medical establishment at the time predicted mass death, but the author notes that smallpox mortality actually continued to drop. For the author, this is ironclad proof that sanitation and not vaccination is what truly controlled the disease. So, pulling back to look at the author's overarching philosophy, this goes way deeper than just vaccine safety. The text fundamentally rejects standard virology. It questions the entire concept of viral contagion, proposing instead that what we think of as transmissible diseases are actually caused by shared deprivation, malnutrition, and a poor biological terrain. In this worldview, shared environments cause shared symptoms. There's no virus jumping from person to person. And because of that, the author views vaccines as a completely toxic solution to a totally invented problem. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and the deepest underlying question this book poses: what if the diseases we fear are not caused by what we catch, but by what we lack? It is a massive, radical departure from basically everything established in modern medicine. So we'll leave you to objectively reflect on these claims and the truly profound implications they raise. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.